I stood behind a pillar 40 feet from my own wife, close enough to smell her perfume, and she never once turned around. In 14 years of marriage, Angela never learned to check who was behind her, because she never had a reason to think I would be. That morning, I watched her hand her boarding pass to the gate agent with a smile I hadn't seen her give me in over a year, and I already knew the flight she was boarding wasn't the one she told me about at breakfast. I had the real itinerary folded in my jacket pocket. I had known for 6 days, and I was flying to the same city she was, on the same plane, seated 4 rows behind her, watching the woman I married walk toward a man I had never met but already hated. 3 weeks earlier, Angela told me she was taking a girls' trip with her college roommate. The same story she'd used twice before without me thinking twice about it. This time, a single notification on our shared cloud storage changed everything. A flight confirmation that synced to my phone by accident, listing 2 passengers, and the second name wasn't her roommate's. It was a man's. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't confront her the next morning either. Instead, I did something I never thought I was capable of. I started paying attention, really paying attention, to every detail she'd stopped bothering to hide because she assumed I'd never look. What I found over those 6 days didn't just answer who Xavier Holt was. It answered questions I didn't know I needed to ask about our entire marriage. Questions about a business dinner 8 months ago that ran until 2 a.m., about a hotel charge from a spa weekend that was never actually spent at a spa, about why Angela started taking her phone into the bathroom to charge it overnight. Every piece I found led to another piece, and by the time I boarded that plane behind her, I wasn't just a husband chasing down a hunch. I was a man who already knew the ending and was flying 4 hours to watch it happen in person. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Angela didn't know was that I hadn't come to that city to catch her in the act. I had already caught her. I came with a folder of evidence 6 days in the making, a hotel reservation of my own 2 floors below hers, and divorce papers already drafted and signed on my end, waiting for a single moment I intended to choose myself. She thought she was flying toward a secret. I was flying toward a decision I had already made, and the only question left was whether Xavier Holt had any idea what he was walking into, or whether he was about to find out the same way I did, all at once, with no warning at all. That I met Angela the summer I turned 26, at a mutual friend's cookout in a backyard in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she showed up late, apologized to no one, and somehow made the whole party feel like it had been waiting for her to arrive. She had a laugh that carried across a room and an opinion about everything. And within 20 minutes of meeting her, I understood why every man at that cookout kept finding a reason to walk past the drink table. I wasn't the loudest person there, and I wasn't trying to be. I asked her one question about the book she was carrying, and she talked to me for the next 2 hours like everyone else in that backyard had disappeared. We married 3 years later, in a small church wedding her grandmother insisted on. With $200 we didn't really have going toward a reception, neither of us remembers much of now except how hard we laughed during the toasts. Angela was working her way up at a marketing firm downtown, ambitious in a way I found magnetic rather than intimidating, and I was 2 years into a stable job in logistics that paid the bills and let her take the professional risks she wanted to take. We built the kind of life people compliment at dinner parties. A house in a good school district we didn't need yet. Sunday dinners with her mother. A dog neither of us particularly wanted, but both of us ended up loving more than either would admit. For the first 9 years, I would have told anyone who asked that I married the right person. Angela remembered things about me I'd forgotten about myself. She kept a running list of restaurants she wanted us to try and crossed them off one by one over the years like a private scoreboard only the 2 of us understood. When my father got sick, she took 2 weeks off work without being asked to sit with me in a hospital waiting room in Durham, and she never once made it about her own exhaustion. I used to tell my brother that the secret to a good marriage wasn't excitement. It was choosing someone who showed up, and Angela showed up, every single time, for almost a decade. I think about our 5th anniversary a lot now, more than almost any other memory from our marriage. Angela surprised me with a weekend trip to a cabin outside Asheville. No cell service, no laptop, nothing but the 2 of us and a fireplace neither of us knew how to properly light. We stayed up until 3 in the morning that first night talking about what we wanted our life to look like in 10 years, a bigger house eventually, maybe a kid or two, a version of ourselves we were building together on purpose. I remember thinking, lying next to her that night, that I had genuinely found the person I was supposed to spend my life with. I didn't know then how much I would need to hold on to that memory later, as proof that at least some of what we had was real. For those first several years, the rhythm of our marriage felt almost effortless. Angela had a gift for making ordinary weeks feel like they mattered. A Tuesday night dinner turned into an occasion because she lit candles for no reason. A rough day at my job turned bearable because she'd have something waiting for me when I got home that told me she'd been thinking about me while I was gone. I wasn't a perfect husband, and I never pretended to be. I worked long hours some seasons and missed things I shouldn't have missed. But we always found our way back to each other, and for a long time, that felt like enough proof that whatever came at us, we'd handle it together. The shift didn't happen all at once, and that's part of what made it so easy to miss. It started around the time Angela was promoted to director at her firm, a job that came with more travel, more late nights, and a new circle of colleagues I only knew from the names she mentioned in passing. I remember being genuinely proud of her that year, throwing a small dinner with her closest friends to celebrate, telling anyone who would listen that my wife had worked harder than anyone I knew to earn that title. I never once considered that the same promotion giving her more independence and more unsupervised time would also give her more room to build a version of her life I wasn't part of. Her new position came with quarterly conferences in cities I'd never been to, client dinners that ran later than they used to, and a work phone she started keeping separate from her personal one, which she explained as a company requirement for data security. I accepted that explanation the same way I accepted every other one that came along in those months, because Angela had never given me a reason to question her, and because I genuinely wanted to be the kind of husband who supported his wife's career instead of resenting the demands it placed on our time together. I told myself the change in her schedule explained the change in her mood, that ambition looks like distance sometimes, that a woman working harder than she ever had was allowed to come home tired and less talkative than she used to be. I gave her the benefit of every doubt I had, because giving people I loved the benefit of the doubt was something I'd always been good at, maybe too good at. Looking back now, I can point to a dozen small moments I explained away without a second thought. The way she started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. The way a work trip to Nashville turned into an extra unplanned night with an explanation that made sense at the time but doesn't anymore. The way she stopped asking me to come to her company's holiday parties, first with an excuse about it being boring for spouses, and eventually without any excuse at all, just an assumption that I wouldn't want to go. None of it felt like betrayal while it was happening. It felt like a marriage settling into a new, busier rhythm, the kind every long relationship goes through. Around that same time, my brother Terrence said something to me at a family cookout that I brushed off completely, but which I've thought about constantly since. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Angela seemed different lately, distracted in a way he couldn't quite name, and asked if everything was okay between us. I told him things were fine, better than fine, just busy with her promotion. He didn't push it, and I didn't think about it again for months. Looking back, I've wondered how many other people noticed something shifting in her before I did, simply because I was too close to the situation, too committed to the version of our marriage I wanted to keep believing in, to see what an outside observer could see clearly from a single conversation at a cookout. The first moment I actually let myself feel uneasy came on an ordinary Tuesday night. Nothing dramatic about it at all. Angela was in the shower, and her phone buzzed twice on the kitchen counter where she'd left it charging. I wasn't the kind of husband who checked his wife's phone, and I still didn't check it that night. But I saw the screen light up long enough to catch a name I didn't recognize, saved under a contact label that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain to myself yet. I told myself it was nothing. A colleague. A client. Someone from the new team she was managing. I went to bed that night and didn't mention it, and some part of me has regretted staying quiet ever since, because that was the night everything I'm about to tell you actually began. In the weeks that followed, I noticed Angela had started keeping her laptop closed whenever I walked into a room, a small habit that hadn't existed before and one I explained away as work confidentiality for a new client account. She began going to the gym at odd hours, sometimes as late as 9 at night, coming home flushed and energized in a way that made sense on its own but felt, in hindsight, like it belonged to a different kind of exertion entirely. I want to be honest with you about something. Some part of me noticed all of this in real time. I just didn't want to be the kind of husband who turned small observations into accusations, so I let each one pass without comment, one after another, until there were simply too many to keep explaining away. 3 weeks after that night, Angela sat across from me at dinner and told me she and her college roommate, Denise, were finally taking the trip they'd been talking about for years, for days at a resort while I stayed home to handle the dog and the house. I nodded and asked the questions a supportive husband asks. Which flight? Which resort? Did she need help booking anything? And she answered every one of them smoothly, with details specific enough that I had no reason to doubt her. That's what got me looking back. It wasn't a clumsy lie. It was a rehearsed one, delivered by someone who had clearly told a version of this story before and knew exactly which details made it believable. 2 days later, our shared cloud storage synced a flight confirmation email to my phone, the kind of accidental notification that happens when two accounts are still linked from years earlier and neither person remembers to check. I almost swiped it away without reading it. Instead, I opened it and read a passenger list with 2 names on it. Angela's and a name I had never heard her mention once in 14 years of marriage, Xavier Holt. I read it 3 times before it fully registered, and even then, I told myself there had to be an explanation, a coworker sharing a flight for a work reason, anything other than what my gut was already telling me. I didn't confront her that night, and I didn't confront her the next morning either. Instead, I sat with the decision for 2 full days, and during that window, I made one call I knew carried risk, to Denise herself, the roommate Angela claimed to be traveling with. I framed it casually, asking if she was excited for the trip, hoping to catch a natural reaction that would either confirm or destroy the story Angela had told me. Denise paused just half a second too long before asking what trip I meant. I made up an excuse about mixing up dates and got off the phone quickly, my hands unsteady in a way they hadn't been in years. Denise had no idea she'd just confirmed, without meaning to, that the girl's trip never existed at all. I chose the harder path on purpose. If I confronted her with one email, she could explain it away in 30 seconds, and I would never actually know the truth, only whatever version of it she decided to give me. So I made a choice that surprised even me. I quietly booked myself on the same flight, in a seat far enough from hers that she wouldn't notice me, and I decided I would find out everything before I said a single word. Before I made any final decision, I called my brother Terrence, the only person I trusted enough to say the words out loud before I was ready to say them to anyone else. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me the one question I hadn't fully answered for myself yet, whether I wanted to save the marriage or end it. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet, and that not knowing was exactly why I needed proof before I did anything else. He didn't tell me I was wrong for following her. He told me to be careful, to document everything, and to remember that whatever I found, I couldn't unsee it once I did. I've thought about that warning almost every day since. In those same 2 days, I did what anyone in my position would probably do, and searched for whatever I could find about Xavier Holt online. His profile picture showed a man about my age, a marketing consultant based in the same city Angela's flight was heading to, with a public account full of gym photos, a golden retriever, and captions that read like someone who had no idea he might be involved with a married woman. I studied that profile longer than I probably should have, looking for some sign, some detail that would tell me whether this was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, or someone who might be just as unaware of the full situation as I had been until 6 days earlier. I didn't have an answer yet. I wouldn't get one until that hotel doorway, days later. The 4 days leading up to her departure were some of the hardest of my life, not because of what I knew, but because of what I had to pretend not to know. I helped her pack, folding a dress I now understood was likely for someone else's benefit, not mine. I drove her to get her nails done the day before, the way I always did before her trips, sitting in a nail salon parking lot answering work emails while the woman I was quietly preparing to leave got ready for a trip to be with another man. Every ordinary domestic moment we shared that week felt like it belonged to 2 different marriages happening at once, the one Angela believed we were still in, and the one I already knew was over. 2 nights before her flight, while Angela was in the shower, I checked the navigation history on her car's infotainment system, something I'd never thought to do before in 14 years of marriage. Buried in the recent destinations was an address I didn't recognize, searched 3 separate times over the past 2 months, always in the evening, always for trips lasting close to 2 hours round trip. I wrote the address down on a note in my phone and didn't think much more about it that night, but it would end up matching more than I expected once I connected it, days later, to a name that finally made sense of everything. The night before she left, Angela made dinner, something she rarely did on weeknights, and for a moment, sitting across from her at our kitchen table, I let myself wonder if I was wrong. Maybe the passenger list had an explanation. Maybe I was about to destroy something real over a misunderstanding. I almost said something to her that night, almost asked her directly who Xavier Holt was and let her explain it away or not. But I stopped myself, because some part of me already knew that if I asked, she would simply lie better, and I would lose the one advantage I had left, the fact that she had no idea I already knew. There was one moment, the morning of her departure, when I nearly gave everything away. Angela asked me, while packing her toiletry bag, to grab her phone charger from the kitchen counter, and I walked in just as a text notification lit up the screen, a name I now recognized instantly. I stood there half a second too long, and she called out asking if I'd found it, her voice carrying just enough suspicion that my chest tightened. I answered normally, grabbed the charger, and handed it to her without a flicker of what I was feeling, and she never looked at me twice. It was the closest I came, in 4 days of careful silence, to losing the one advantage that mattered most, the fact that she still believed I knew nothing at all. I kissed her goodbye the next morning for what she still called a girl's trip with Denise, and I watched her walk toward airport security without a single crack in the performance either of us was putting on, though only one of us knew we were performing. I drove home from dropping her off, packed a bag of my own in under 20 minutes, and booked a seat on the next available flight to the same city, paying for it out of a personal account she didn't have access to. 90 minutes after her flight left, I boarded a different gate for the same destination, carrying a folder Angela had no idea existed and a version of calm I didn't know I was capable of until that morning. By the time my plane landed, I had already spent those 90 minutes going through 8 months of shared credit card statements on my phone, cross-referencing dates against her calendar, against her supposed business trips, against every excuse I had accepted without question over the past year. A charge at a boutique hotel in Savannah on a night she told me she was staying late at the office. A dinner reservation for 2 at a restaurant 300 miles from where her conference was supposed to be. None of it proved anything on its own. Together, it told a story I no longer needed convincing of, and I hadn't even reached the gate yet. I landed 40 minutes after Angela did, and I already knew which hotel she was staying at, because I'd found the reservation confirmation buried in an email folder she'd forgotten to delete. I checked into a room 2 floors below hers under my own name, paid for out of an account she never looked at, and sat on the edge of that bed for nearly an hour before I could make myself move again. Somewhere above me, in a hotel I now shared with her without her knowledge, my wife was checking in with a man I had never met, and I had to decide what kind of husband I was going to be for the rest of this trip, patient or reckless. I chose patient because I needed proof, not just for myself but for what would come after. I spent that first evening in the hotel bar, close enough to the lobby to see who came and went, and for the first hour, I second-guessed myself more than once. A man in a gray suit walked through the lobby around 6, and my entire body tensed before I realized he was clearly waiting for someone else entirely, an older woman who greeted him warmly near the concierge desk. I sat with that false alarm long enough to wonder if I'd built an entire theory out of nothing, if the name on that flight confirmation really was just a coworker after all, and for a few minutes, I almost let myself hope for it. Then, just after 7 o'clock, I watched Angela step off the elevator in a dress I didn't recognize, laughing at something before she'd even reached the man waiting for her near the entrance. Xavier Holt was taller than I expected, easy in the way he touched her lower back to guide her toward the door, the kind of familiar that doesn't happen on a first meeting. Whatever hope I'd let myself feel 20 minutes earlier disappeared the second I saw that gesture. I didn't follow them that night. I didn't need to. I already had what that single moment told me, and I spent the rest of the evening sitting alone in my hotel room, staring at a ceiling, letting it settle. The next morning, I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but which ended up matching more than almost anything else I uncovered on that trip. I struck up a conversation with the hotel's day shift concierge, an older man named Walter, under the pretense of asking about a restaurant recommendation. Somewhere in the small talk, I mentioned I thought I recognized a couple from the elevator the night before, and Walter, without any idea what he was actually confirming for me, mentioned that the couple in 412 were regulars, always polite, always requested the same room whenever they came through. I asked how often that was. He thought about it and said probably every 6 to 8 weeks for at least the past year. I thanked him and walked out to the parking lot before he could see my face change. Sitting in my car afterward, I let myself consider, for the first time since landing, that I might be wrong about the timeline. Maybe Walter was thinking of a different couple. Maybe the memory of a friendly, familiar pair was just a concierge's habit of making every regular guest sound like they've been coming forever. I called Terrence from that parking lot, and he talked me through it calmly, reminding me that one detail from one source wasn't proof of anything on its own, and that I needed more before I let myself believe the worst possible version of this story. He was right, and over the following 2 days, I found exactly the confirmation he told me I'd need, piece by piece, until there was no version of events left that didn't point to the same conclusion. Over the next 2 days, I built a record most investigators would have respected: time-stamped photographs, a hotel receipt showing a room booked under both their names for the full 4 nights, and a conversation with a bartender who mentioned, without knowing who I was, that the couple in room 412 had been regulars at that hotel for close to a year. A year. Not 4 days. Not a recent lapse in judgment during a rough patch. A year of a relationship running parallel to our marriage while I sat at home trusting every excuse she gave me. I sat with that number longer than I sat with almost anything else on this trip. On the 3rd morning, I spoke briefly with a member of the housekeeping staff on the 4th floor, again under a harmless pretense, asking about the room I was supposedly considering booking for a future trip. She mentioned, without prompting, that room 412 usually needed the rollaway bed removed each time the same couple checked in, since they always booked it out of habit even though they never used it. It was a small detail, almost meaningless on its own, but it told me something about the rhythm of a routine, a pattern so established that hotel staff had memorized its quirks without knowing either of the 2 names attached to it. Small details like that stopped feeling small by the 3rd day. They felt like evidence stacking on top of evidence, each one closing off another direction I might have used to talk myself out of what I already knew. That afternoon, I sat by the hotel pool for nearly 2 hours, not swimming, just watching families and couples move through an ordinary vacation day, wondering how many of them were exactly who they appeared to be, and how many were carrying some version of the same secret I'd spent 3 days uncovering. It's a strange thing, once you've lived inside a betrayal like this one, how it changes the way you see every other couple around you. Not with suspicion exactly, but with a quiet awareness that the story people present publicly is rarely the whole story. I didn't enjoy that awareness. I've never fully lost it since. I called my mother that evening, something I hadn't planned on doing, but needed to by that point in the trip. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I told her enough, that Angela had been dishonest with me, that I was away confirming something I already suspected. She didn't ask many questions. She simply told me she was proud of me for handling it with a clear head instead of rushing into anything I might regret, and that whatever I decided once I had the full picture, she'd support me completely. It was a short call, maybe 10 minutes, but it steadied me in a way I badly needed heading into the final day of that trip. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The financial trail told its own story once I stopped looking at individual charges and started looking at the pattern. Over 14 months, I found close to $11,000 in expenses I couldn't account for, spa weekends that were never spent at spas, a jewelry purchase I never received, a second phone plan billed quarterly to a business account Angela managed for her firm, which I later confirmed was never actually a business account at all. I sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel that second afternoon, cross-referencing dates on a spreadsheet I built on my laptop, and every entry I confirmed felt like another small piece of the marriage I thought I had quietly disappearing. One charge in particular stopped me for a long time. A florist in our own city, dated the same week as our 10th wedding anniversary, for an arrangement I never received and never asked about because I assumed, at the time, that the flowers on our kitchen table that week had simply come from a different, unremembered errand. Angela had used money from an account I trusted to buy flowers for another man's apartment during the same week. She accepted a dozen roses from me at dinner, and I sat in that coffee shop turning that single detail over in my mind longer than I turned over almost anything else I found that day, because it wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal timed, whether she meant it that way or not, to land directly on top of a date that was supposed to mean something to us. I spent the second night watching the hotel in trance again, this time from a different angle, in a rental car parked across the street where neither Angela nor Xavier would think to look. Around 8, they left together on foot, and I followed at a distance, watching them walk into a restaurant 3 blocks away, the kind of place with candlelight in the windows and a host who greeted them both by name. I didn't go inside. I didn't need another confirmation of what I already understood completely. Instead, I sat in that car for over an hour, watching the window, running through everything Walter had told me that morning, a year, not 4 days, an entire year of a life I had no idea was running alongside mine. The third evening, Angela and Xavier met another couple for dinner at a rooftop restaurant downtown, close enough to the railing that I could take a table 1 level below and still make out fragments of conversation carried on the wind. I heard the other woman ask Angela, casually, how long she and Xavier had been together, and I heard Angela answer without hesitation, almost 2 years now, in a tone so natural it barely registered as a lie to anyone at that table but me. 2 years, not 1. Walter's estimate had actually been generous to me, not the other way around. I sat with my drink going warm in front of me, listening to my wife discuss the anniversary of a relationship I hadn't known existed until 6 days earlier, and I understood then that every number I'd uncovered so far had likely been an undercount. I called an old college friend of mine, someone outside the situation entirely, just to hear a voice that had nothing to do with any of this. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, his kids, a game we'd watched together years ago, and it helped more than I expected, a small reminder that I still had a life outside the 4 walls of this investigation, even if it didn't feel that way in the moment. Later that same night, back near the hotel, I passed close enough to Angela on a bench outside the entrance to catch part of a phone call she was having, her voice low but not quiet enough. She was talking to someone about a lease renewal, mentioning a date in the fall, and for a moment I thought she meant the townhouse I hadn't discovered yet. It wasn't until days later, back home, that I understood what I'd actually overheard, Angela discussing plans for a future that assumed I wouldn't be part of it, a conversation about a life she was already building on the assumption that our marriage had an expiration date only she knew about. I remember lying awake in my own hotel room that night, staring at a ceiling fan I hadn't bothered turning off, trying to reconcile the version of Angela I'd fallen in love with at that backyard cookout years earlier with the version I was uncovering piece by piece in a city 300 miles from home. I didn't hate her yet, not fully, not in that moment. Mostly I felt a strange, disorienting grief for a version of our marriage I now understood had stopped being real longer ago than I wanted to admit. Grief has a way of arriving before anger does, and that night, alone in a hotel room 2 floors below my own wife, grief was the only thing I had room for. I thought, too, about all the versions of Angela I'd defended to other people over the years, the times a friend or coworker made an offhand comment about how demanding her job seemed, and I jumped in to explain how hard she worked and how much I admired her for it. I had spent years as her advocate in rooms she wasn't even in, and sitting in that hotel bed going through message after message. I felt a specific kind of foolishness settle over me, not because I trusted her, but because I defended a version of her that had never fully existed in the first place. That realization stayed with me longer than almost any single piece of evidence I found that week. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had built an entire second life with its own budget, its own alibi system, its own set of lies specific enough to survive years of casual questions from a husband who trusted her completely. What I didn't expect to find, on the third night, was a folder of messages Angela had backed up to our shared cloud storage months earlier, the same account that had accidentally alerted me to this whole trip in the first place. Reading them wasn't something I'm proud of, but by that point I needed to understand not just what had happened, but how long she had been someone capable of this. What I found in those messages didn't just confirm the affair. It suggested this wasn't the first time Angela had built a life like this behind my back, And that discovery changed everything about what I was planning to do next. Buried in messages from 2 years earlier, before Xavier Holt ever entered the picture, I found a name I recognized immediately because I remembered the 6 weeks Angela and I spent in what I believed at the time was marriage counseling. She had told me then that she felt disconnected from me, that she needed us to work on communication, and I had shown up to every session willing to fix whatever was broken between us. Reading those older messages now, I understood that the disconnection she described wasn't something I had caused. It was something she was actively creating with a man named Bryce, a relationship that had ended not because she chose our marriage, but because Bryce had ended it first. The counseling sessions I remembered as us healing together were, in reality, damage control on her end, a performance timed to coincide with the end of an affair I never knew existed, designed to reset our marriage back to a place where she could start again with a clean slate I didn't know I'd been given her. I read through nearly 40 messages between Angela and Bryce that night, watching a relationship unfold in real time from a distance of 2 years, the same affectionate language, the same secret hotel bookings, even the same excuse about a work trip that she would later reuse almost word for word with Xavier. It wasn't just a second affair. It was a pattern, refined the second time around by whatever she'd learned from the first. What unsettled me most wasn't the affair itself, but how precisely I could trace the counseling sessions to the exact week Bryce ended things with her. The messages showed Angela reaching out to a therapist's office 2 days after Bryce's final message and mentioning our marriage to me for the first time that same week, using language about disconnection and communication that I now recognized as borrowed almost directly from what Bryce had told her when he ended it. She hadn't come to me wanting to fix something broken between us. She had come to me needing somewhere to land, and I had spent 6 weeks in a therapist's office trying to repair a version of our marriage that was never actually the problem in the first place. I sat with that realization longer than almost anything else I uncovered on this trip, because it meant the version of our marriage I'd been grieving for the past week wasn't the only version that had been a performance. Possibly years of it had been, stretching back further than I had any way of confirming, and further than I suspected I would ever fully know. I searched further back that night, further than I probably should have, and found one more detail that changed how I understood the entire shape of what I was dealing with. Bryce, it turned out, had been married himself during the affair, something Angela never mentioned to me and likely never told him she knew, based on how casually his name came up in her messages to a coworker months later. I remembered, sitting in that hotel room rereading old messages, a specific session with our counselor where Angela had cried and told me she felt like she'd lost herself somewhere in our marriage, that she needed space to figure out who she was outside of being my wife. I remembered holding her hand in the car afterward, telling her I'd give her whatever space she needed, genuinely believing we were working through something real. Now I understood that the space she'd asked for wasn't distance from our marriage in the abstract. It was room to grieve a relationship with Bryce that had just ended, dressed up in language vague enough that I never once suspected its real source. Angela hadn't stumbled into infidelity twice by accident. She had, on some level, made peace with being the kind of person who could carry on a relationship with someone else's husband, and later let someone else's future carry the same weight with hers. Understanding that didn't make the betrayal hurt less. It made it hurt in a different way, the kind that comes from realizing you were never dealing with a single mistake, but with a pattern this person had learned to live inside of comfortably. I felt a strange guilt that night, too, reading messages I was never meant to see, private conversations from a chapter of Angela's life that had nothing to do with me directly. I reminded myself, more than once, that I hadn't gone looking for Bryce's name. I'd found it while trying to understand a present-day betrayal, and it had simply led somewhere I didn't expect. That distinction mattered to me, sitting alone in that hotel room at nearly 2 in the morning, because I needed to know I was still the kind of person who respected boundaries, even while uncovering the ways mine had been ignored for years. That same night, I finally looked up the address I'd found saved in Angela's car navigation 2 nights before her flight, the one she'd searched 3 times over the past 2 months. It turned out to belong to a townhouse complex 20 minutes from her office, and a quick search of the property records, easy enough to find online, showed the unit was leased under Xavier Holt's name. She hadn't just been meeting him during business trips out of state. She'd been building an entire local routine around him, too. Evenings I'd assumed were spent working late actually spent 20 minutes away in a townhouse I never knew existed. That discovery told me this wasn't a relationship confined to occasional trips. It was woven into the ordinary texture of our week, hiding in plain sight inside evenings I'd never once thought to question. On the fourth morning, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for Angela to fly home and pretend everything was normal before finding the right moment to confront her. I had the folder of evidence. I had divorce papers I'd had drafted and signed before I ever boarded that first flight, prepared quietly over the 2 days I sat with the itinerary before deciding to follow her instead of confronting her immediately. I called the hotel and confirmed Xavier Holt's room number under a pretense, and just after 10 that morning, I knocked on the door of room 412, the same room the bartender had told me about 3 nights earlier. I knocked twice and heard footsteps, then a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone checks a peephole before opening a door. It felt longer than it probably was, standing in that hallway with a folder under my arm and 4 days of quiet, deliberate patience about to end in the next several seconds. Angela opened the door in a hotel robe, and I watched every muscle in her face change in the span of about 2 seconds, confusion, recognition, and then something close to physical panic, all before she managed to say my name. Xavier appeared behind her a moment later, pulling a shirt over his head, and I watched his expression shift too, though not in the way I expected. He didn't look like a man who had just been caught. He looked like a man who was seeing something for the first time, and that difference told me this confrontation was about to reveal something neither Angela nor I had walked into that room expecting. I asked Xavier one question before I said anything else to Angela, whether he knew she was married. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but I watched it land on his face like a physical blow, and when he finally looked at Angela instead of me, I understood the answer before he spoke it out loud. He didn't know. Angela had told him she was divorced, going through the final paperwork, a story convincing enough that he had spent the last year building a real relationship with a woman he believed was free to have one with him. While she used my name, my accounts, and my trust to fund a second life, he had no idea he was only half of. What followed wasn't the confrontation I had rehearsed in my head over 4 days of silence. It was Xavier's, directed entirely at Angela, a man realizing in real time that he had been lied to as thoroughly as I had, just from a different angle. I stood in that doorway and watched my wife try to explain herself to 2 men at once, and for the first time since that flight confirmation synced to my phone weeks earlier, I didn't feel rage. I felt something closer to clarity, the kind that comes from finally seeing a situation exactly as it is, without the version someone else has been managing for you. I handed Angela the folder and the divorce papers, and told her both had been ready since before I ever boarded that first flight, that I hadn't come to that hotel hoping to save anything, only to confirm what I already knew was true. She asked me how long I'd known, and I told her the truth, that I'd known enough the moment that confirmation email synced to my phone, and everything since had only been about understanding the full shape of what I already suspected. Xavier left the room without another word to either of us, and Angela sat down on the edge of that hotel bed, finally out of excuses that could survive contact with the evidence in front of her. I stood in that room for a while longer than I needed to, watching her cry in a way I couldn't tell was genuine grief or the shock of finally being caught after so long believing she never would be. Neither of us said much else that morning. I told her I'd booked my own flight home for the following day, and that I expected her to be out of the house by the time her attorney and mine finished the paperwork, and then I left, walking back to my room 2 floors below to pack a bag I'd hoped, for days earlier, I wouldn't need to use this way. Angela stayed in that hotel room after I left, and I found out later from a mutual friend that Xavier checked out that same afternoon and never spoke to her again, not out of anger toward her alone, but because whatever he believed they were building together had been built entirely on a lie he had no part in creating. I felt something close to sympathy for him in the weeks that followed, a stranger who ended up just as deceived as I had been, just for a shorter amount of time. I never reached out to him, and he never reached out to me. Some stories don't need a final conversation to reach their ending. I flew home 2 days later, alone, to a house that still had her belongings in every room and a dog who had no idea anything had changed yet. Angela came home 4 days after that, and we spent one final, strange week living under the same roof while lawyers exchanged the paperwork I'd already had drawn up weeks earlier. She tried, in that week, to explain herself in ways that shifted depending on the day. First, that it had been a mistake she regretted, then that our marriage had stopped meeting her needs long before Xavier. Then, toward the end, something closer to an admission that she didn't fully understand why she'd done any of it herself. I listened to all of it, because I owed myself that much closure, but none of it changed the decision I'd already made in that hotel room 300 miles from home. The divorce process that followed over the next several months revealed exactly what I expected it to, that the $11,000 I'd found was only a fraction of what she'd spent maintaining 2 relationships I knew about, and possibly others I never uncovered. Our finances took nearly a year to fully untangle, complicated by the second account she'd used to fund parts of the affair, and complicated further by her initial refusal to disclose it until her own attorney advised her that hiding it would only cost her more in the end. I got the house. She got the car, and roughly half of what remained after the debts she'd quietly built were accounted for. Terrence helped me move the last of her things out on a Saturday in early spring, and neither of us said much while we did it. We ended up in mediation twice before the final agreement was signed, both sessions tense in ways I hadn't fully prepared myself for. Angela's attorney tried, in the first session, to frame the townhouse lease and the hidden account as separate from the marriage entirely, a private matter that shouldn't factor into the financial settlement. My attorney disagreed, and the documentation I'd gathered in that hotel 4 states away turned out to be exactly the kind of evidence that made the second session considerably shorter than the first. I sat across a conference table from Angela both times, closer to her than I'd been since that hotel doorway, and neither of us said more than what the lawyers required us to say. The final signing happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. No dramatic final conversation. No last words exchanged that either of us would remember fondly. Angela signed her half of the papers first, then slid the folder across the table for me to sign mine. The same folder, in some ways, that had started this entire chapter of my life weeks earlier in a different city. I remember thinking, as I signed my name for the last time next to hers, that the version of myself who boarded that flight 4 states away already knew this moment was coming. I just hadn't known yet what it would feel like to actually arrive at it. What stayed with me longest wasn't the anger, though there was plenty of that in the early months, showing up at strange times, in a grocery store aisle, during a song on the radio, in the quiet of a house that used to feel full. It was the quieter realization that trust isn't something you lose all at once. It's something someone takes from you slowly, in small enough pieces that you don't notice it's gone until you're standing in a hotel doorway 300 miles from home, holding proof of exactly how much. Angela's mother called me twice in the weeks after the divorce was finalized, both times to apologize on behalf of a daughter she said she'd raised better than this, and both times I told her gently that she didn't owe me an apology for choices that weren't hers. My own family, especially Terrence, showed up for me in ways I hadn't fully appreciated while I was still married. Sunday dinners that used to feel obligatory suddenly felt like the only stable thing in my week, a reminder that the family I still had left was worth protecting the same way I'd once tried to protect my marriage. The dog, at least, adjusted faster than either of us humans did, and some mornings, sitting in a kitchen that finally felt like it belonged only to me, that was the small, steady comfort that got me through. Those first few weeks alone were quieter than I expected grief to be. I kept the house running on a schedule I hadn't realized Angela had built around me. Coffee at the same time every morning, the dog walked at the same 2 intervals, small routines that had nothing to do with her specifically, but that I noticed sharply in her absence anyway. I didn't cry as often as I thought I would. Mostly, I sat with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in over a year, the stillness of no longer needing to explain anything away, no longer scanning for inconsistencies in stories that used to almost add up. It wasn't peace exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something close to it. Denise called me about 2 months after everything became final, apologizing for a role in this. She said she never fully understood herself. Angela had asked her, years earlier, to be a general cover story if I ever needed to reach her while she was traveling, without ever specifying why, and Denise, trusting her old friend, had agreed without asking too many questions. She told me she felt used once she understood the full extent of what her name had been attached to, and she apologized in a way that felt genuine. even though none of it had ever really been her fault. I told her I didn't blame her, and I meant it. Angela hadn't just deceived me. She'd quietly pulled other people into the architecture of that deception without their full knowledge, and Denise was only the first person I learned had been used that way. I started seeing a therapist of my own about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, not because anyone told me to, but because I recognized in myself a pattern I didn't like, replaying the same 4 days over and over, looking for a moment I might have missed something sooner. My therapist helped me understand that the 6 days I spent gathering proof before confronting Angela weren't a failure of trust in myself, the way I'd started to frame it in my own head, but an act of self-respect, a refusal to let someone else control what I was allowed to know about my own life. That reframing mattered more than I expected it to. It let me stop asking myself what was wrong with me for not seeing it sooner, and start recognizing what I did right once I finally did. Somewhere in that same stretch of months, I started dating again, slowly and without much urgency, mostly because Terrence kept insisting I couldn't stay locked in the same routine forever. Nothing serious came of it right away, and I wasn't looking for anything serious, just proof to myself that trust wasn't something I'd lost the capacity for entirely. What surprised me most was how much easier it felt to notice small inconsistencies now, not out of suspicion, but out of a kind of clarity I'd earned the hard way. I no longer explained things away automatically. I asked questions when something didn't add up, calmly, directly, the way I wished I'd asked Angela years earlier, long before a flight confirmation ever synced to my phone by accident. I still keep that folder, the original one, tucked in a drawer in my home office, not out of any need to relive it, but as a strange kind of reminder. Proof that when it mattered most, I trusted myself enough to look for the truth instead of settling for whatever version someone else was willing to give me. Some nights, when I'm working on a video like this one and thinking through how to tell a story that might help someone else recognize their own situation, I think about that folder sitting a few feet away, and I'm reminded why I started sharing stories like this in the first place. Not for the views, though I'm grateful every one of you shows up, for the version of myself and the version of you who needed to hear that trusting your instincts is never something to apologize for. Angela and I haven't spoken in close to a year now, aside from the occasional logistical email about paperwork neither of us wanted to deal with. I don't know what her life looks like these days, whether she's still with Xavier, whether she's found some new version of the pattern she seemed to repeat, or whether this experience changed something in her the way it changed something permanent in me. I've made peace with not knowing, because chasing answers about her life would only pull me back into a version of myself I worked hard to leave behind in that hotel room 300 miles from home. If you're sitting with a version of this story right now, still gathering pieces, still unsure whether to trust what your gut is already telling you, I hope this hour gave you something more valuable than entertainment. I hope it gave you permission to trust yourself the way I eventually learned to trust myself, for days into a trip I never expected to take, standing in a hotel doorway 300 miles from a home that would never quite feel the same again once I walked back through its front door. It's been over a year now since that trip, and I've rebuilt a version of my life I'm proud of, one that no longer requires me to explain away small inconsistencies I have no reason to ignore anymore. Looking back on those 4 days now, I still ask myself the same question people in the comments always ask me, whether I should have confronted Angela the moment I saw that flight confirmation, instead of spending 6 days building a case before I ever said a word. I don't regret the choice I made. I needed the truth, not just an explanation I'd have no way to verify, and the only way to get it was to see it for myself before giving her the chance to control the story the way she'd controlled every story between us for years. But I understand why not everyone would have made the same choice, and I'm genuinely curious what you would have done in my position. Would you have confronted her the moment you found that itinerary, or would you have done what I did and followed the evidence until there was nothing left to explain away? Let me know in the comments, because I read every single one, and some of the most honest conversations on this channel happen down there, not up here. If there's one thing I wish someone had told me before all of this happened, it's that the small inconsistencies are rarely as small as they feel in the moment. A phone charged in the bathroom instead of the bedroom. A calendar that suddenly has gaps you're not invited into. A partner who stops asking you to be part of parts of their life they used to want you in. None of those things prove anything on their own, and I'm not telling you to distrust everyone you love based on a single changed habit. But I am telling you that patterns matter more than any single moment does, and that the version of yourself who trusts your own instincts, even when you desperately want to be wrong, is usually the version worth listening to. If this story kept you watching until the very end, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for, because we tell true stories about betrayal, about the moments people find out who someone really is, and about what it takes to walk away with your dignity intact. I think back sometimes to that pillar at the airport, 40 feet from a woman I'd spent 14 years building a life with, watching her hand her boarding pass to a gate agent with a smile that no longer had anything to do with me. I didn't know that morning exactly how the next 4 days would unfold, only that I was finally choosing to see clearly instead of continuing to look away. If there's a lesson in that moment worth carrying with you, it's this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't the loud confrontation people expect. It's the quiet decision to follow the truth all the way to the end, even when part of you is terrified of where it leads. A lot of you who've followed this channel for a while already know we hear from people going through some version of this story every single week, in the comments, in messages, in stories some of you have shared that ended up shaping future videos on this channel. Some of the messages I've received since I first started sharing pieces of this story stay with me longer than I expect them to. People describing their own version of a phone charged overnight in the wrong room, their own version of a calendar with gaps they weren't invited into, their own quiet decision about whether to confront or to wait and gather the full picture first. I don't have a universal answer for what the right choice is in every situation, because every marriage, every betrayal, carries its own specific weight. What I can tell you, from the other side of mine, is that whichever path you choose, choosing to know the truth, even when it's the harder road, tends to be the choice people regret the least. If any part of what I described tonight sounds familiar to something you're going through right now, I want you to know you're not imagining the small inconsistencies you keep noticing, and you're not overreacting by wanting real answers instead of comfortable explanations. Trust your instincts. They're usually more accurate than you give them credit for, and this channel exists, in part, to remind you of that every single week. If you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'll see you in the next one.